Alex, can you hear me in the back? Okay. Good morning. Thank you everyone for being here. No more so than to our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment. For those who I haven't met, I'm Megan Karsh. I started as the Vice President of Initiatives in April here at the Pacific Council. Pacific Council's initiatives are opportunities for members to get involved in impact-oriented programming created and run by the Council to address key foreign policy issues. Relatedly, the Pacific Council also occasionally provides institutional support to member-created impact projects like the one we'll be discussing today. Where members are tackling important foreign policy issues in innovative ways, the Council can partner to increase impact and to educate our other members about the important work. Which takes us to the Project to Strategically Protect Soft Networks, or SPSN. SPSN was created by Steve Miska, a retired U.S. Army colonel and Pacific Council member. First, I should address soft networks. You may be unfamiliar with the term in the foreign policy context, which illustrates how overlooked the issue has been by the policy community and media during the last decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Soft networks are local nationals in countries where the U.S. is at war who provide invaluable support to American diplomatic, military, intelligence, and law enforcement operations. Their support may take the form of translation, interpretation, operational assistance, many other roles. The engagement and protection of such local partners is absolutely critical to successful military operations and to United States foreign policy, as our panelists will attest. The Project to Strategically Protect Soft Networks is a public-private enterprise developing and proposing policy approaches to protect these brave individuals and engaging policymakers to put the issue at the fore of combat decisions. Today, however, we'll come down from the sky-high policy level to the individuals who know the topic intimately and who struggle with the consequences of America's approaches to soft networks to date. Today will be more of a storytelling session than anything else. It's my privilege to introduce our panelists, not only because I so deeply admire their service and commitment to this issue, but because protecting soft networks is near and dear to my heart. From 2012 through 16, I ran a state-building collaboration between the U.S. Department of State, Stanford, and American University of Afghanistan. Our partner faculty and staff in Kabul worked with us at great personal risk. When perceived foreign supporters began being targeted in Kabul in 2014, we attempted to protect our network as best we could for 2 years with little success. One faculty member received a special immigrant visa in 2014 and now lives safely in California. We ratcheted up our efforts in summer 2016 when the threats reached critical levels, but to no avail. 16 perished in a terrorist attack on the university in August 2016. So I can personally attest to how critical this issue is from a security, policy, and human dignity level. With that, let me introduce our panel. To the right of me, I have Steve Miska, who I mentioned is a retired U.S. Army colonel, Pacific Council member, and the founder of SPSN, who will provide the perspective of government practitioners on the ground who depend dearly on local partners. To my left, I have Fadi Mahdi, is that correctly? Who is a local national contractor working alongside the American military in Iraq and who face the complexity and risk that inevitably entailed. And finally, to my far right, I have Sarah Feinberg, who also has experience relying on soft networks in combat as a Marine Corps officer leading patrols in Iraq. Today, however, she'll focus on her experience of protecting soft networks at the individual level at home by welcoming an Afghan family into her home as a sponsor. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve, who will take about 10 minutes to just let me stop talking about him and talk about himself and the project in his own words.
Thanks, Megan. Can everybody hear me out there? Thank you all for being here today, and I really would like to thank the Pacific Council as well for being such a wonderful partner in this effort to strengthen our national security endeavors abroad. That's what the policy development effort is all about. But I'm not going to talk about policy today because Megan just said this is a storytelling exercise. And so I'm going to tell a story from the perspective of a practitioner in the field. Not necessarily a military practitioner, but anybody in the U.S. government faces this problem if they're abroad. And every ambassador who I've spoken to about this initiative or who has come on board to support it has implored me to not let it become a DoD-only effort to strengthen or get our SOF networks to be more resilient. They've said it is a whole of government problem. Do not let DoD, which tends to be the 800-pound gorilla in the interagency, don't let DoD take this project for themselves, which unfortunately isn't really an issue because it's hard getting attention sometimes with DoD. But let me tell you a story, and the story is going to be my personal awakening to this problem. And I was on my second combat tour in Iraq, in Baghdad, in 2006 and 2007, and it was a sectarian bloodbath. Our patrols were finding, on average, 275 bodies a week dumped in the streets, and our interpreters were probably doing the most dangerous job in the world at the time. They were collaborating with Americans. And so there were people in government who were trying to kill our interpreters. There were people in the security forces. There were Jaish al-Mahdi militia, Al-Qaeda, Sunni insurgents. Everybody knew that our interpreters were a vulnerability for our ability to interface with the population. And a guy named George Packer came in to do an embed. He's a reporter with the New Yorker. He has a gifted pen. And I was excited because I had read George's book, Assassin's Gate, and I knew how good of a journalist he was. And he ended up having to leave early because his wife went into labor. And I was disappointed. I thought, well, nothing much is going to come from that story because he was only here for a few hours. And he had interviewed a few folks, but then he was gone, and absolutely rightly so. He needed to get home to be with his wife. About 2 months later, he sent me the link to a 15,000 plus word article with a one-word title. And the title was Betrayed. Now, 2 weeks before that, Nadal, who had been a store owner on our base for 4 years, was shot and killed by Shia militia in the streets of Baghdad. And 2 weeks before Nadal was murdered, Jack, who was an interpreter who went on patrol with me every day, was killed by Sunni insurgents in Balad when he went home to be with his wife, who had just given birth to stillborn twins. The level of tragedy was just brutal, and personally, I couldn't make it through George's article. It was that gripping, and still is if I go back and read it to this day. And so that was my awakening. I realized that I could not look myself in the mirror. My team, we couldn't look each other in the eyes if we weren't doing something to protect our Iraqi partners who were going on patrol every day with us, putting themselves in harm's way. And really, they were taking more risk than we were in a lot of ways because their families were in play. My family was back in Germany at the time, safely on a U.S. military base. So it was easy for me to throw myself into the fight, but they were taking significant risk because their families were exposed in many cases. And we didn't have a lot of tools to help them. We didn't know much of what we could do. And so what the project is, and what I've been doing ever since, is trying to develop more policy options beyond this special immigrant visa, which was an effective tool but should be a policy of last resort, and which is why we have Fadi here today alive, because we have that really incredible tool, and why your family was able to come from Afghanistan and be sponsored. But it's, we can do better than that. And I'll just stop my story there so we can hear some of my colleagues here tell theirs, and then we'll get into some more of the policy aspects of it.
Fadi, so it'd be wonderful just to hear a bit of your take on it and about your background in your own words.
Hello everyone, thanks again for coming and thanks for having me. My name is Fadi Madi. I worked as a combat interpreter with the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps for a bit over 4 years. It all started, actually I got recruited about 20 feet away from my home. The U.S. military was doing a house-to-house search. They were looking, I guess, for some bad guys and weapons and whatnot. And they were having some problems with one of my neighbors. They could not communicate. And we're talking, this is May 2003. So about a couple of months right after the fall of Saddam's regime. At the time, I spoke pretty good English because that was my major in college. So I offered to help and they accepted my help. So I helped the captain at the time communicate with the neighbors, sorted out whatever the problem was, because everybody was yelling at everybody and they were ready to shoot someone in a way. So that problem was taken care of. I helped that unit all day that day until they were done with my neighborhood. At the end of the day, the captain offered if I could help them again tomorrow. And I was like, you know what?
Long term.
Yeah, I'll agree. And he was like, okay, and we'll compensate you. I was like, fine, that is great. And it started from there. So it was not meant to, to be hired or anything like that. It was simply to provide help. It kept on going for about 5-6 months. Then I was assigned to be transferred to Ramadi, which is Western Iraq, or Al-Anbar province. That's the bigger picture. I worked in Al-Anbar province for about almost a year and a half. During that time, I served in Ramadi, Fallujah, a little bit of, it's called Al-Habani Air Base, but mainly Ramadi and Fallujah. I worked there with the U.S. military and the Marine Corps. During that time, my ID, my, let's call it linguist badge, was leaked into the public. So one day a gentleman approached me in the base. He was a janitor. And in the base, by the way, my known name was Alan, or nickname was Alan. Just to make it easier, not everybody could pronounce Fadi. It gets forgotten a lot. So I think Alan. Yeah. So that janitor reached me and he was like, so your name is not Alan, it's Fadi. And I was like, no, it's Alan. I was like, no, it's Fadi. There is a copy of your badge with your name on it in the mosque in the middle of the city. That day, I made the decision that I'm not going home again. I'm staying on that base until I either die with the military or, find safe way home. We were about 15 local hired linguists. 2 of us are only alive today. That's me and another guy. It was pure luck that this guy approached me that day and told me about this. Otherwise, I was scheduled to go home next week. Had I not known that my ID was out there, I've been caught. Because the ones that made or tried to go home were all captured and killed within the week after. During that time, I was about on close to 500 combat missions. I served again alongside the military and the Marine Corps, especially after the attacks or the murder of the Blackwater contractors in Fallujah. The first attack on Fallujah, I was there. I was with the Marines house to house. I wasn't promised anything. If anybody was thinking that I was promised a visa or anything to that extent, I was doing it for 2 reasons. One, because I believed this is going to help make Iraq better, because that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be in Iraq, a better country to live there forever. Second thing, at that time after I found out that I was stuck, is because I was stuck. I've got nothing better to do. There was a joke around, if there is a mission that no U.S. hired linguist wanted to go to, call Fadi. Fadi will go. Because I was bored at the base, and I was like, fine, we'll go. There's going to be, probably attacks, and I was like, I'll go, it's better than sitting here. During that time, I was shot once during combat. I broke my arm once during combat. About approximately 50 IED attacks that I survived and my team was survived. I lost a lot of friends from both sides, Americans and Iraqis. And about, I'd say, 10 to 15 car bombs that we managed to dodge. I don't know how I'm here today, if it's pure luck or I'm blessed, or call it whatever you call it. After that, I moved to Baghdad. One thing I wanted to say before going to that point is when the last unit I worked with was leaving, I had to find another place because I was getting tired of, getting attacked every day, getting shot every day. I was wondering when would be the day my luck would run out. So I managed to secure a job with the INIS, or the Iraqi National Intelligence Agency. So now the trick is to leave Ramadi and go to Baghdad. So I begged the military unit at the time to provide transportation. Otherwise, I would have to either get a taxi or drive myself. And that road from Ramadi to Baghdad was called the death road for people like me. You're not going to make it alive. There were like one promise that we might fly you, but don't count on it. And I kept pushed on, and I was about to lose that job opportunity because the INIS wasn't going to wait for me to show up. I ended up driving myself from Ramadi to Baghdad. I was attacked at the road, and blessed enough, there was a military convoy, a U.S. military convoy. I could see them. And to get their attention, I had to shoot at them. And just sparked the car, left the car, and laid on the road. Because I know their procedure. They're pretty much gonna fire a couple of shots to warn, to find out if it's who shot at them. And I was hoping they would arrest me that day, because these guys were chasing me in another car. They were shooting at me too. That's how I managed to get a ride finally from I worked for the INIS for a while. Then luckily I met my beautiful wife. She's here, Amanda. She was an analyst, an intelligence analyst at the time. And that's why I'm here. I went back again, which probably some of you think you're crazy, as a DoD contractor. This time I worked in Mosul, which is up north in Iraq. It's actually, in my opinion, it was worse than Ramadi. So I've kind of seen it all. I think, like Steve said, a lot of the folks that I worked with that are local hires didn't have the same luck or fortune that I had. At the time when I came to the US, by the way, to correct you, Steve, I didn't come on the SIV. SIV didn't exist when I came here. I came here on a fiancé visa. So I know a lot of people that deserve to have that SIV, but I'm a firm believer that if measures or certain things were put in place to protect identities of these people, we wouldn't need the SIV. But like he said, the SIV would be the last resort to have. What I want to say is a lot of us were good assets to the U.S. Call us linguists, call us cultural advisors, call us people that help the U.S. military communicate just with the public in a way, understand the public. In a lot of cases, I know I had stopped, and I'm not bragging, but what could be a bloodbath just because of miscommunication or somebody tried to do something to offend or that offended someone. And in the Middle East, that's big. I mean, if you offend somebody, it could mean bad. Things could happen. That's pretty much, I guess, in a nutshell, my story. I hope I didn't bore you. Thank you.
Understatement if I've ever heard one. Just a little story in a nutshell. It's incredible, Fadi. I'm sure people have a lot of questions for you, but we'll turn to Sarah first, and then I'll maybe direct a few questions to the panelists and then open it up to all of you. Also, just while I have your attention, could we put cell phones on silent? That would be much appreciated.
That is quite a story to follow. I'm not gonna, I cannot top that. So my background is I served as a Marine Corps officer in Iraq from 2009 till 2010, so it was a much calmer time than what Patty did there. But I led convoys, and so I had interpreters on every one of my convoys, and that was to help us be able to interact with the local nationals when a car broke down or when one of our vehicles broke down, when we would have to stop traffic. And so exactly to your point, just the communication allowed us to have a much more peaceful interaction with the local population and establish better relationships with them. So I got out of the Marine Corps in 2012 and did not really give a lot of thought to what happened to the interpreters afterwards. And as a civilian then watching what was happening with ISIS sweeping through Iraq, it was this just devastating look at the country that I had come from, and I had served there, and I had seen the local population and worked with the children there, and to see us kind of turn our backs on what was happening in Iraq at that time was devastating. And it was just this constant. My husband and I would talk about what can we do personally to help this. I didn't want to go back into the military because we had 3 children at the time. But in the Paris attacks in 2015, that happened, I guess it was November of 2015, the backlash against refugees was the most concerning thing to me. To see these people who we had worked with and said that we were there to support their security, they were now being demonized because they were refugees. So my husband and I had just moved out of our home. I had twins in 2015, so we were moving into a larger house. We put our old house on the market. I said, you know what, why don't we sponsor a refugee family? Why don't we host them in this house rather than sell our house? And so my husband thought I was crazy. He's like, how are we gonna afford this? I was like, I don't know, we'll figure it out. So I called Catholic Charities, which was the local resettlement agency in Virginia where I live. And they said, you know, we have a family coming in from Afghanistan. He's actually he's on a special immigrant visa for serving with USAID. I was like, great. As long as they have kids, it's a great school system. This will be a great place for them to settle. So I reached out to our church. I was actually nervous about reaching out because my whole community, the Christian community, my political community were very anti-refugee. And so part of my goal in hosting a family would be to humanize Muslims, humanize people of the other. And so so that was a lot of our focus. The goal of my husband and I was, one, to actually help a family who was in the middle of assimilation and going from Afghanistan to the U.S., which is a very difficult transition, but also to set the example for the rest of our community that if we're willing to have this family in our home with our kids, you should be willing to as well. And it was amazing, the response from our church. I sent out an email to our church saying, I have a house ready to go. I need it furnished. I need clothes for the kids. And so within 30 minutes, we had 30 people who had volunteered everything necessary to set up the home and to host this family. So that was 2015. Fast forward to today, Arif, Miss Ari, is doing great. Their kids are in school with our kids. We all live in the same neighborhood. They've been here for, I guess, 3 years now, like you said. We've had Thanksgiving. We've introduced them to the Super Bowl. All kinds of American cultural traditions. And he actually works now running the IT, and he's an office manager for my husband now at his company. So he's made this transition. But the reason that he got the special immigrant visa was because he served alongside the USAID actually in Afghanistan, and because of that, his children were threatened. So the Taliban threatened to kill his daughter, who was 9 at the time. And so they had to go into hiding for the 2 years that he was waiting for the visa to come through. So the kids had not been outside in a year by the time that they got to our home. So it was great to have them. They got there at night and couldn't speak any English. The next day, the sun came up and they saw that there was a park in the backyard, the school right around the corner, and it was very exciting to kind of to see that these are to see them adapt to the culture here in the U.S., but also helping put a face on these people. They're not just numbers, and they're not just assets that are disposable. They're human beings and their families, and we have a moral obligation to take care of them when they serve alongside us.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Picking up on that last point, I just want to actually give Fadi an opportunity to speak to what Sarah said about it's so complicated. The stakes are so much higher than even just threats against the individual who chooses to help the U.S. because of the nature of sort of the social networks and familial networks. It's very easy to figure out the leverage points and to try to sort of terrorize people in the soft networks by going after their family. And to that point, Fadi, I was wondering if you would speak about what happened to your brother after you ended up coming to the U.S.
So back when I moved to work for the INIS, I guess that's when Al-Qaeda started catching up that I am in fact working for the Americans or collaborating with the Americans. So that's when the death threats to my family's home started coming. First one came with a hand grenade, that if you don't quit, we're gonna kill you. Of course, we maintained, again, that time I decided again not to leave the building that I worked at and stay there, but my family was still at risk. We managed to, my family was pretty good at denying that I am working with anybody and I'm actually outside of the country. I'm in Jordan, and nobody knows. I tried to be less seen in the streets, I guess, if that's to be true. They kept on pushing the issue until I came here to the U.S. A month after I arrived to the U.S., they actually went into my house, Al-Qaeda did, and looking for me. When they couldn't find me, they took my brother. And they were like, they were telling my family, you want, my brother's name is Faiz, you want Faiz back? We need Fadi. Give us Fadi, we'll give you that one. And they kept telling them that he's outside of the country. I was like, well, have him call us. We want the brother. We want Fadi. I was here. I was not fun at all. And I ended up negotiating for the life of my brother. Luckily, we had some counter-terrorism training that includes some training about how to negotiate hostage negotiations when I was at the INIS. And I managed to switch them or sway them from asking for me and instead compensating them for money to buy my brother's life in a way. I was like, hey, you could kill him, what are you gonna gain? Or you could kill me, what are you gonna gain? We could probably give you a few bucks here and there that would at least help your cause, kind of play into their hand in a way. And that sunk in, luckily, because otherwise my brother wouldn't be, he's here in the US too, by the way, so he wouldn't be here. So that's pretty much the kind of threat that they have. I mean, they may not have reached me directly while I was working with the Americans, but families, like Sarah said, these are the ones that are exposed. They're in the street, so that's where the real danger is. I mean, if something would have happened to me when I was with the military, I would understand. It's not just me. It's me and 50 soldiers that are with me that could happen to anybody, but my family's got nothing to do with this. And these guys are going after families because this is the softer target.
It's definitely a tactic. Steve, I'll direct this to you first and then Sarah, ask you to weigh in. Obviously there's a huge emotional and human component to this, but is this just, as Steve puts it, Mother Teresa foreign policy, or are there also real national security interests here? What are the national security implications of failing to do this the right way?
Thanks, Megan. This is not just a moral imperative, which it is. It's absolutely in our real national security interest to do a better job of this. Number one, our men and women who are serving in harm's way right now are at risk when their interpreter, their cultural advisor, their local national partner doesn't know whether or not the United States is going to stand by them if the chips go the wrong way. And so those relationships are already tenuous out there abroad. And so that's absolutely a definite national security interest that we have in doing this better. But beyond that, we've got law enforcement out conducting investigations into terrorist attacks and other nefarious organizations that are out there after us. And if people see that America doesn't stand by them, how likely are they going to be to contribute to those law enforcement investigations that are ongoing, that we need the intelligence for in order to preempt some of these attacks? We've got relationships with host nation security services. When they see that we don't even take care of the people who are going on patrol with us every day, they don't know whether or not to trust Americans. It's counter to our narratives wherever we're abroad, and it undermines our legitimacy and our credibility if we don't take care of those who stand by us when we're in harm's way. And then lastly, I'd say, and I end up talking about this on Capitol Hill every year when the SIV legislation comes under question, it's actually an issue for our veteran population, not just the military veteran. Megan's a perfect example. We come back with these really rough memories, and guilt is a pretty tough thing to deal with. And if you know that your most trusted partner is still out there in harm's way, and you are ashamed of your country for not doing anything about it, and you're feeling impotent in your own ability to live up to at least the ethos that we learned in our time in service, which was leave nobody behind, but you feel like you're violating that ethos. My question is to policymakers, is that how we want our young men and women to leave their time in service?
Sarah, do you have anything you want to add?
I think Steve covered most of it, but yeah, I think the three main reasons are, one, it's absolutely necessary from a security standpoint on the ground. We can't recruit interpreters if they know that we're going to abandon them down the road. And as they watch these policy fights go on and our senators here in the U.S. rejecting their visas, I think it sends a message while we actually have troops on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. The second one is, to your point, the moral obligation that we feel coming back from combat zones to, we were willing to sacrifice our lives to go there and fight or support the troops on the ground, and to abandon the people who served alongside us is not in our ethos as Marines. And Matt Zeller, who we both work with closely, he started.
I wasn't a Marine, by the way. I just want you to know.
But Matt Zeller, who's one of our good friends, who started an organization called No One Left Behind to support these SIVs who are coming to the U.S. and to help get them set up here. But so it's, one, the security aspect, two, the moral obligation, and three, it really sends a message to our allies. If the people who supported us when we were at our most vulnerable in combat operations on other soil, if we're willing to abandon those allies, then how much more willing are we going to be to abandon our other allies around the world?
Thanks, Sarah. And on that point about the difficulty recruiting, I did have a question about recruitment. Fadi, it sounded like you started working with the U.S. military on an ad hoc basis, like, hey, work for us for a day, another day. But once it became clear that it would be a longer-term commitment, what, if anything, was conveyed about the protection we would provide? Were there any guarantees made, or were there even discussions about it?
No, Megan, actually, there were no discussion as far as, or promises as far as, like, we'll protect you if something happened. Actually, when I first started, it was not as bad as when the threat actually started happening. And even when my information was leaked, when I went to the captain that I was working with at the time, it's like, this is what's going on, what do we do to take care of this or to fix this? He just shrugged and looked at me and was like, I don't know what to tell you. Wow. Just don't go home. And I was like, well, that's okay, but for how long? Because we still got to do something about it. So as far as like promises made on protection, it's not. Jokingly, sorry to add, one of them was like, do you want us to put a couple of Humvees in front of your house? And I was like, well, that'll make it worse. Don't do that, actually. I will confirm that.
So to tie together a few threads, because it sounds like there isn't much of, there wasn't necessarily a process or thought for security with recruitment, and then Steve, you said that it's been very hard to get DoD's attention, but you guys just said that soft networks are critical to successful military operations. What's happening within DoD? You know, what is their take on it? Why has it been so hard to engage them on this issue if it is such a critical part of military operations?
Well, let's just, I worked for DoD for 25 years, but I would also say it's not just a problem in DoD, right? It's across the government, and I wouldn't characterize it as a nefarious sort of, it's a bandwidth issue, quite frankly. It's and I had that same perspective, so I understand it. You know, I'm in Baghdad, I've got the mothers and fathers of our country have entrusted their sons and daughters to me as a leader, and that's my obligation, is to try to do what I can to protect them while accomplishing the mission that I've been given. And now all of a sudden somebody's telling me I need to take care of all these other people, and what do you do? Well, there are things we can do, but it's really hard to get the attention of some of the policymakers on that. Now, I would say, number one, I would say no administration has done this well. I've been in dialogue with senior directors on the National Security Council, and they are interested in this, and that would be a way to attempt to address the policy-making process from a top-down angle. So there's possibility there, and we've also looked at a bottom-up approach as well. It's interesting, those on active duty recognize this is a problem, but their bandwidth is an issue. Those of us who are veterans really feel this is a problem, and in the veteran community, this is well known and something that veterans want to address, whether it's through starting No One Left Behind or going to work for We Are the Mighty here in Hollywood and telling the story through film or other medium. Veterans are out there in this space. Fadi is a veteran. He's got more combat time than I do, and I had 40 months in Iraq. So, you know, and a lot of his brothers and sisters who are out there with us in harm's way are veterans. And so, you know, we're working on it, and we're hitting Capitol Hill and elsewhere.
Well, and I'll let the audience maybe have a chance to probe, but you guys should ask about what Steve's trying to do, where it's about different avenues to try to resolve the issue, and different points of leverage, and also things that we can do kind of as private citizens, or that active duty military individuals can kind of do on their own. So just trying to think creatively about this really vexing issue. But before we get into that, can you just say what's the current status like at the U.S. policy level right now, Sarah and Steve?
So the SIVs were included in the NDAAs in the past until 2015, 2016, when Jeff Sessions stripped them out. And he did not, it was kind of a backlash on Muslim immigrants, and so he thought that we also shouldn't even allow people who had served alongside us to come in on special immigrant visas. So that's how Steve and I met, actually, was lobbying, trying to lobby his office. He wouldn't even meet with us on that issue. But it was added back in at a later date. Right now, the program is at risk. The visas have not been authorized this year. So we're trying to push Senator Shelby to add 4,000 visas to fund that. So you can explain maybe more of that.
Yeah, no, it's basically what happened, and is absolutely right. The traditional legislative vehicle for the special immigrant visa has been the National Defense Authorization Act. And so each year it's a concerted effort by organizations that we represent to attempt to convince members of Congress, which actually there's wide bipartisan support for it. There's generally usually only a few what I would call obstructionists. And so that is one area, though, that we continue to have to focus on each year. But as Fadi said, that should really be a policy of last resort. There are a lot of other things we can be doing in order to do a better job of proactively insulating our soft networks. And that's where the departments and agencies have a lot of room to grow. And So our project is research-based in developing best practices to feed into the policy development process, but also we are very much trying to advocate on behalf of a policy development process itself and get that moving in government as well. So
I'll ask one last question, then we'll turn it over to all of you for questions. But Sarah, I'll put it to you, since as now an American citizen, no longer in the military, you've taken some very big steps to help. What can the average American do from as big of a step as you've taken to maybe smaller steps? What are concrete things people can do to help with this challenge?
Yeah, I would say organizations like Matt Zeller's of No One Left Behind, it's totally run by private citizens, funding it, helping those who have the special immigrant visas, those who arrive in the U.S., is helping get them set up in homes. Also, if you are gainfully employed, I would encourage you to hire people here on SIVs. They do become American citizens. They're legal from the time that they get on our soil to work. And I think that to me was one of the biggest challenges, was trying to help them find jobs. And it's so difficult to come to the U.S. and try to find try to get a job when you don't have access to credit to transfer your skills. So if you're an accountant in one country, it doesn't transfer to being an accountant here. If you're a doctor in another country, it doesn't translate, and there's no way to get a loan to take the right tests to do that. So I think being able to helping guide people through that process. So reaching out to your local resettlement agency. There's 9 authorized resettlement agencies in the country. I reached out to Catholic Charities, but helping kind of guide newcomers to the U.S. through the job search process, I think, is really beneficial.
Great. And I'd like to open it up to the audience if we have any questions. Sure. Alex, do we have a microphone?
Great question. Start right now with just talking about.
Okay, Sonny, you might have to just talk up.
Thank you. Thanks for having you all. Steve, I have a question. We've been in a perpetual war since 9/11. Basically, the Patriot Act is signed, and any president can just attack anywhere, anytime. Doesn't need Congress approval. So, in light of that, wouldn't that be? And also, we have access to. We have a great military, but access to contractors, i.e., mercenaries. They're available, ready to go where action is. Why can't we have, as part of it, what you're doing, part of this DoD program that, hey guys, you over there, because we were there at Civic Council early on, and we met people like Fadi that, because Admiral Harvard was doing all these conference calls, the state of the art, with various parts. So without these guys, none of this would have happened. We were very impressed that it was like running a Fortune 500. He was sitting there with the general from Afghanistan side, with people like Fadi, and they had conference calls all over the troops in the area. So it is so crucial, and why wouldn't that be part of this Patriot Act or anything like that, that you over there you're gonna need these guys. Therefore, after 6 months, you've got to issue something, paperwork, protection.
That's a great question. Number one, what I would say is, because you point out we have been in perpetual contact since 9/11, this is not a new phenomenon. And so I came back from 3 combat tours in Iraq, so frustrated by the lack of policy options that I decided, okay, I don't understand the policy development process, so I'm going to go to DC and try to figure out what that's all about. And so I ended up doing 3 combat tours in DC. They were harder in some ways. And I wrote a thesis on this subject, though, and one of the chapters that I decided to write was on the Revolutionary War. Because our founding fathers in this country executed this strategy very effectively against the British. They went after loyalists and others supporting the crown and undermined that soft network. They did that very effectively to the greatest superpower of the world at the time. So if that's a logical strategy that adversaries fighting from a position of weakness will pursue, we should anticipate it and have a response at least, or proactively address it. Part of the challenge is very much the complexity that arises when we contract out for these services. And so we're outsourcing to the contracting community for X number of linguists or logistical support, whatever it happens to be. And so we've got a third party now involved, and they're engaging in explicit contracts where money is passing hands, but then Fadi and Sarah go out on patrol and they engage in an implicit contract. And that implicit contract is built on the trust of that relationship and then sharing risks day in and day out. And that's a very different type of contract. And so now we've got this triangular relationship going on with how we're prosecuting conflict. And that's just the same applies beyond DoD. It's not just a DoD complexity. The State Department does that as well, and other organizations in our government. And I think that's part of the problem. Nobody is really, I don't think there are too many nefarious actors out there. And so one of the ways we're going about trying to do better at this is bring the contracting community to the table as well. And I'm speaking in DC next month at the International Stability Operations Association Annual Summit on this very topic. And Ambassador Ryan Crocker is going to address it. He's one of their keynote speakers. And he's also a policy advisor for the Soft Networks project. So it's difficult, it's complex, and so there's not an easy solution, and it requires a whole of government approach, and our government is intentionally designed to be dysfunctional, so it's just gonna take time. Sorry, that's not a good answer.
Any further questions? I'll take up here and then earmarking in the back. Yep.
Because of where we've been in conflict for so long, is this, and I've got to be careful how I phrase this, but is this a Muslim problem? Is this a problem is because most of the people you're talking about in this soft network are Muslim, and that starts coming into play because, like you said, maybe the Jeff Sessions, there was something there. Is there, how broad is it? How many people are we talking about? You know, are we talking about 10 people a week, or are we talking about 10,000 a week? I mean, how broad is it, and is it very narrow to the Muslim community?
Do you mean specifically about the like how many people would come here on an SIV?
Well, or how many people do we want to provide something for? You know, what kind of a problem are we talking about?
And we've talked about that. I mean, and this is why Steve is focused on improving these in country, so that it's not just that SIVs are used as a last resort, not as a first resort. But I do want to be clear that when the application for an SIV is made, they have to prove that they were actually under threat. So it's not just anyone who served with the U.S. military in Afghanistan or Iraq can now come and become a U.S. citizen. It's that they have to prove that there was an actual threat, and they have to have a sponsor in the U.S. who backs up their claims that they served the U.S. So it's a very stringent process, and it takes years. So it's not, what we're asking for this year is 4,000 visas.
The other thing I would say on that is this is not an Iraq or Afghanistan problem only. We're in Somalia, we're in Yemen, it's not just a Muslim issue. People who work with Americans in difficult situations will get targeted by our adversaries. It's a logical strategy. If I were fighting from a position of weakness, that would be something I would consider. We're just in Afghanistan, if you look at that, where the estimates that I've been seeing is there are 50,000 people in the backlog just for the special immigrant visa.
Wow.
If you look at numbers of who our contractors are hiring abroad, we are at least in the tens of thousands, if not greater than that. So, and these are people who we could not conduct our operations with, whether they're in embassies or on military bases or elsewhere.
Well, and just quickly on the SIV visa, the need for kind of a coherent policy, because in the early days, a number of the SIVs for Afghanistan went to USAID just because those applications got pushed through faster. It wasn't necessarily who was most under threat, and then there was sort of an arbitrary decision to make the guidelines more stringent in 2014. So for example, I mean, I'm grateful for any life we were able to help get out, but my one colleague who I said made it to Modesto was probably the least of threat out of all of them. He just got his visa in faster because he had also done work with USAID a couple of years prior, although we were with INL. I had promised the gentleman in the back, and then I'll come forward.
On the narrow question of translators, for the future, is there a technological answer that can reduce the necessity of these people?
What do you think, buddy? Can you be replaced with an iPhone?
You can, probably. There is an app for that. The issue is that it's not just being a translator. You're a cultural advisor. You're there. You know the area more than anybody else. I mean, you could understand what they're saying through an app or whatever, but you may not understand exactly what's the meaning, the real meaning behind it. Mm-hmm. It's not just a word per word or word per word verbatim kind of translation. It's more about what's behind that translation. Mm-hmm. So again, that's why I call them translators / cultural advisors. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there's going to be an app.
I would say when an app is able to be my cultural eyes, ears, and mouthpiece, then maybe I'd trust it, but I would not take this over a guy like that on patrol with me.
That's because you're not under
I'd leave
20.
this on the base.
To give you a sense of the limitations, the language piece is not great either. My project helped work on the translation with the U.S. military, and they one time sat across from one of my colleagues who's an academic, and the translation came back to him, and we just saw his eyes go really wide, and we were like, "Stop there!" Like, you don't even have to tell us, but we know it was something bad, and it didn't quite capture it. Over here to this gentleman in the second row.
Given how sensitive it is specifically from security perspective for their respective families, when you outsource the service, and I think Fadi mentioned two important points. The first one, out of 15 people, 2 survived, and obviously their respective families were really under attack, which is very serious from a human perspective. Given, I think, the diversity in the United States, did you explore an option where you can train someone who speaks the language of these respective countries? They are U.S. citizens, part of the military, and send them in these missions instead of recruiting domestically and put families and respective under risk.
Yeah, we function that way as a matter of routine. So I started an underground railroad in Baghdad in 2007 when I was awakened to this issue, and got about 36 interpreters out via the special immigrant visa. 6 of those guys, when they got to the United States, immediately enlisted in the Marines or the Army and deployed back as combat interpreters. Fadi went back as a civilian DoD combat interpreter. And so they generally, interpreters are categorized based on their security clearance. So a local national hire has no clearance. An American first line interpreter coming in usually has a secret level clearance. Those would be the ones who would go into meetings with me and Sarah to engage with sheikhs or police chiefs or others. And then we even have linguists with top secret level clearances who do other things for us in the area. But yes, they are very expensive to train and hire, and we never have enough of them, and so that's why we end up going with a lot of local national hires. And quite frankly, I would say Hassan, who was a guardian angel for me in Baghdad, was from Benghazi, Libya. He understood all of the tribal mores and much of the culture, but he didn't understand Iraqi culture the way Fadi understands Iraqi culture. And so there's just that level of nuance to be effective in what you're trying to do.
So who I've seen, if I go in order, is the gentleman in the aisle here, and then the woman in the back, and then...
Thank
yes,
you.
sir.
I find it somewhat depressing that we could have had the same panel 40 years ago talking about people left behind in Vietnam and Laos and elsewhere in Southeast Asia who had helped American troops there. Did anything happen after that is useful today? I mean, this topic was examined in considerable detail then. I don't think that much was done, but I'm just wondering, was there anything done that would benefit what you're trying to do today?
Yeah, we've looked for historical proxies and best practices that way. I would say 250,000 Vietnamese emigrated to the United States after the conflict from 1975 to 1980. But just like today, at that time, you had foreign service officers with the State Department, you had active duty military officers violate official policy and still get people out of harm's way, despite the fact that it could come back and have ramifications to their careers. And this is a policy option that many of the ambassadors that I deal with, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey talked about this, he's a Vietnam vet himself. Basically, this is where our values and our hard national security interests actually overlap pretty well. It's really something that we should be able to do better, and we just haven't gotten there yet. And so that's what the project's all about, is trying to mobilize the interagency, and our colleagues here at the Pacific Council in academia are doing the research to add creativity and capacity to that policy development process.
Yes, in the back.
Several times you've talked about how the SIV is the remedy of last resort. So whether the remedies of first resort or second resort, what do you have specifically that you can enlighten us about that would help?
I mean, the first thing is that we would have hoped that Iraq and Afghanistan were secure countries, and we wouldn't have been there for 18 years. So if that had been the impact of the military on the ground there for the last 18 years, then we wouldn't be in a situation where people are still being executed because of their service with the U.S. So that's the starting point, is just to win wars rather than stay there for generations.
But the proactive side of things, it all revolves around what you were hearing Fadi talk about, that he was doing in an ad hoc nature, right? It's identity protection is the first principle. And then should that fail, for whatever reason, we look for local relocation options. And so what we've been doing on the research side is looking at when you look at it from a cyber perspective, for example, we try to help our practitioners who are going into the field realize, hey, it's not a good idea if you take a picture with your interpreter and post it on Facebook. That's not okay. And the interpreters need that training as well, because they don't know any better, and they're working with somebody in uniform for the first time and helping the Americans, and then all of a sudden they've got a problem because the terrorists are out there scouring that. So identity protection is the first issue. We've looked at a lot of different areas where how the media does it in conflict zones with their local national stringers and fixers, because we've got journalists who are going into Syria to report on stories. They rely on local nationals just as much as we do. NGOs in conflict zones, and we've looked for their best practices, as well as we've looked at domestic law enforcement as well. We've got programs here in the United States, witness security, or witness protection, more commonly referred to. How we insulate battered spouses. and other vulnerable people. And we're looking to harvest those best practices and infuse them into the policy development process. But it's hard because it goes back to your point, you know, is this a Muslim issue? I would say no, but it is a cultural issue from an organizational culture perspective. And that's part of what a good pre-deployment training would do is it would get our men and women who are going into harm's way to think about these challenges in advance and figure out what they would do to mitigate the risk.
Yes, I think I didn't have anyone on hold, right? So this gentleman right here.
Fadi, I wanted to take advantage of your background. What do you think the future of Iraq will be? The stability of the country looking forward? If you could.
That's a tough question. Looking at the way things are going right now, in my opinion, I still see Iran pretty much involved in whatever policy being made in Iraq. So stability maybe to a certain level, but as far as like stability and more prosperity, no, not as long as Iran is still in play. Because anybody you have in the government right now is somehow funded, supported, or endorsed by Iran, starting from the prime minister and going down. Any policy or any decision being made had to be okayed somehow by Iran. We have General Ali Soleimani, who's still who's probably most wanted in the U.S. List, touring Iraq and making policy, pretty much making things the way he wants to. And as long as, you know, this guy is around or Iran is involved in this country, it's not.
So why is it bad? I mean, why would it bad? For stability, they both need economic development, they have youth.
Correct. Look, Iran is a neighbor country, so they'd have to have some sort of relation. So think about it this way. How would you like it if the Prime Minister of Canada came here and tried to get involved in U.S. policy? Tried to shape your U.S. policy?
Did they?
I don't like it.
I want a different analogy.
It's one of these things, right? It's the interference in general. I mean, you would want to be independent. You would want to be stable. You know, they're a country that have their own stability, and Iraq should be a country that would have their own stability. I mean, I hope I got the idea right, but that's, I think, the main problem.
So we have time probably for 2, maybe 3 more questions. I've seen this hand up for a while.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming in. This has been really great. My name is Tapring, and I'm a researcher. And so when I think about your guys' relationships deployed and in your home, I'm thinking that it's a coercive relationship. And you spoke about you didn't know from day to day how you'd be compensated and how you didn't get the transportation support needed. And I'm wondering, and how you have this, there may be feelings of guilt and camaraderie that are left unanswered by the American system. Are there other aspects that, now having years in perspective, that you wish we would have provided, we as Americans would have provided for your safety and your well-being, to make it not a financial compensation, but also a safety and well-being perspective?
Well, when I first started, it was not as bad as, like I said, a year after. It was totally safe. It was totally fine to work with the U.S. military. I mean, insurgency at the time wasn't as active or as hyper, I would say. So financial compensation was something that I was going for, to be honest. And then once we got into more serious, I mean, as far as like danger goes, all I hoped is, at least, I mean, one of the ideas my wife and I were talking about is if they had provided transportation to these linguists from the base to somewhere to where it would be a common base. Like at the time we were talking the airport. Baghdad International Airport hosted one of the largest U.S. military bases in Iraq. So if they had driven these linguists to the airport, and then as a linguist you would be leaving the airport, it would look like you just came back from outside of the country. That would have been probably one of the ideas this way. If anybody captures you or asks you on the road, it's like, I just flew in from a different country, and yeah, that would have been probably one of the things.
Seems pretty simple and affordable.
Yeah, it doesn't cost anything. I mean, they have convoys going in and out of the airport every day. They have flights that go in and out of the airport, military flights, into the airport every day. That's what I tried to get on when I was trying to leave Ramadi to Baghdad, and they kept pushing me and pushing me and pushing me until I was like, it's time to go.
Thank you.
I just got the red sign of 2 minutes. I know that we could take questions forever, but I did want to give Sarah, Steve, and Fadi a chance if they had any last words they wanted to say to wrap up. So unfortunately, I am going to have to cut the questions right now. Sarah, do you have anything?
As Steve works on the policy around these issues, I think there are still things that we as just Americans can do around them. So I would encourage you to get involved and to reach out to immigrants and especially special immigrant visa recipients in your community and see how you can help.
I think the SIV visa is a great program, but I also agree that it should be a last resort. There has to be a way or means to secure these, let's call them soft networks that we have as U.S. military on the ground. But then if push comes to shove, then SIV it is.
Yeah, I would echo Sarah's comments. There are ways that you can help if you would like. We're always looking for researchers. But No One Left Behind has a chapter in San Diego. Mandy, Fadi's wife, actually manages it down there in San Diego. They are a great organization that helps with sustainable housing and employment if somebody is fortunate enough to make it here. If you know of somebody who's in harm's way, there's another organization in New York called IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project. They are a gifted legal organization that advocates for those who are vulnerable and out there abroad. And they also help us with a lot of folks in the soft network arena. So there's a lot of different ways to get involved, and I think we're all happy to stick around and answer any other questions. I know there are some folks who didn't get to ask them, so please feel free to come up and fire away.
So I will just wrap up. It hasn't been a traditional policy panel in a lot of ways, so I'll close in maybe an untraditional way with a note of gratitude. So first of all, thank you to all of you for attending. Second, it's a gift when people make themselves and their stories, especially painful memories, available for other people's education and growth. So thank you guys, genuinely, and especially you, Fadi, for sharing your stories today. Third, thank you to all three of you for your service, and that's not a cheap throwaway. Thank you for your service. We especially very well deserved applause. At least in this room, you have people who really appreciate what service means. And Fadi, as Steve noted, you're as much a veteran as anyone. And finally, thanks to Fadi and Mandy, whose book is available. I hope you consider perusing it when you leave, who are drawing attention to this issue of soft networks. Thanks to Sarah, who's doing her piece. And especially thanks to Steve and the Soft SPSN project. I've had the privilege to work with Steve closely over the last 6 months, and he truly inspires me with his vision for the project. So the Pacific Council is honored to be able to support it. Thank you guys so much.